First, though, before verse 1, we need to back up to chapter 5. So back up to 2 Samuel 5, because I want to really show you David's first step downward this morning. David desensitized his conscience by incomplete obedience. You remember I pointed this out in the life of Saul several months back. I said that Saul, the king before David, his downfall was selective obedience. God told him to do something, and he said, well, I don't like all that, but I'll take the little part I do like, and I'll do that. That is always a step downward in our spiritual lives. When we selectively obey God, when we only obey the parts that are easy or the parts we want to, and not the parts that are hard and we don't want to do, when we do that, we begin a process of disobedience. Because partial obedience, selective obedience, is disobedience. That's what David does. 2 Samuel 5, and look at verse 13. As we read this verse, it reminds me of the warning signals. Have you ever had a warning signal on your car, especially? I didn't know ours had so many. Recently it said low tire pressure. Usually I see door ajar. Well, it said low tire pressure. Well, I thought, I banged it a couple times, thought that's nothing. So I drove home. The tire was almost flat. And I thought, how did the dashboard know my tire was almost flat? I mean, unbelievable. Reminds me when I was younger. Do any of you remember when they started putting into cars buzzers for seatbelts? Any of you old enough to remember that? It was the most annoying thing. I mean, cars had seatbelts. I don't remember when they started, but they didn't matter at all until they put the buzzers in. And all of a sudden you get in the car and you start it and until you click that thing. And it just was so annoying. Well, I was pretty smart mechanically. I got under while it was and I pulled the thing out. The car stopped running. It was hooked into the whole ignition system of the car. Smart. Put it back in, had to buckle my seatbelt. Did you know that's what we like with warnings? We like to pull them out. We don't want to hear them. David didn't pay attention to the warning signal in his life. What am I talking about? Well, it says in 2 Samuel 5:13 that David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. Now remember, David has already been king by the time he gets to 2 Samuel 5. By the time he gets there, he had been king 7 years. He started his kingship in Hebron. Then he moves into Jerusalem after 7 years when he makes that his capital. And so notice what it says. David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. When David set up his kingship in Jerusalem, he was an old pro at this, being a king. But he'd forgotten something. This just sounds like you're reading the news when you read this first part of verse 13. Nothing major, nothing bad. It's kind of neutral. After he'd come from Hebron, it says in the rest of the verse, more sons and daughters were born to David. So what's wrong with that? I mean, when you read the Bible, don't you just say, what's wrong with that? Didn't all the men back then do it? Didn't Abraham have multiple wives? Jacob had several wives. Why, they're all God's people. What's so bad about that? If God says it's wrong, it's wrong. Even if everybody else does it. But did God say it was wrong? Well, we need to backtrack on what happened to David when he became the king. Because 600 years after Abraham had all of his wives, God had Moses write down in the Bible rules for kings. Did you know that? Did you know that when David became the king, he was instructed by the priests and read from the law of God what God wanted from him? It's just a little short section of the Bible. In fact, turn back with me to the book of Deuteronomy, and I want you to look at it, chapter 17. Because I want to show you what God wrote and what David read and what David stopped obeying, which desensitized his conscience. This is the only instruction, Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 15, the only instructions God gave for the king of Israel. David was only the second king. David was following a king who crashed and burned because of his partial and selective obedience. So I'm sure David would have carefully listened to these words as he was anointed king, because Samuel knew them. The priests knew them. Those who possessed the law of God knew them because they were doing something new. They were having their only second king of all. And so these words were, I'm sure, intoned to David, the man who knew the Bible so well. He quotes from Deuteronomy all the time in the Psalms. So this was his marching order from God. Starting in verse 15 of chapter 17, I want you to follow along. I'm going to read God's instructions for his leaders. Deuteronomy 17:15. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. So that's David. So here we're tracking. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You shall not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Verse 16. He shall not multiply horses for himself. Well, David didn't have a problem with that. Solomon did, but David didn't. Nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. David didn't have a problem with that. His son did. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way again. Verse 17. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. David, up until that moment that he became king, he had Ahinoam, and he had, Abigail, and he had Michal, so he had at least 3 wives. But the moment he became king, he wasn't off the radar screen, kind of down there what got overlooked, because God intended one man, one woman for life, but they had kind of gotten this polygamy thing if you're wealthy enough to afford it. But once he became king, God says, look at verse 17, neither shall David, when he becomes king, multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. But he did get the next statement, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. David knew that. What did he do with everything he conquered as a king? He donated it all to the Lord, dedicated it all to the Lord, put it in the Lord's treasuries. But in this one little area. Now, when I read this 17th verse, the first part of it, I think of, if you ever drive up I-44 towards St. Louis, do you ever notice on the side of the road in Missouri, there's a big sign that says, what part of thou shalt not is not clear? Have you ever seen that? What part of thou shalt not don't you understand? Right? Look what this says. Thou shalt not multiply wives for yourself if you're going to be king. This is the code the kings were supposed to live by. It's very powerful. It's God's instructions for his leaders. Very, very few instructions. And David, in 2 Samuel 5:13, blew right by that commandment. And it says he took many wives for himself. He desensitized himself. David personally disobeyed God because he multiplied for himself wives and possibly multiplied for himself opportunities for his heart to get turned away. Now keep reading. Look at verse 18. God says, don't do that. But he also told him something else to do. Look at verse 18. And it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. So this is how we know he read it, because this was the very foundational element of a king's rule, was to personally write down the Torah, the Pentateuch, the law of God. Now that would have taken a long time. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, has 5,852 verses, which comes down to just under 160,000 Hebrew words. So this week, as I was studying, I pulled out my pen and paper, and I wrote one Hebrew verse down. And I had to copy it, from the Hebrew Bible, and I was sitting there. Now I had a nice, easy-to-use pen. I didn't have to keep, cleaning it off and sharpening it and dipping it in the inkwell. And I was writing on plain old paper, and I didn't have to spread it out and try and write on animal skin or whatever. And I timed how long it took me to write one verse. It says here that David had to write all 160,000 Hebrew words of the first 5 books. Look what it says. He shall write for himself a copy of this law. And it's not speaking of this verse. The law at that time spoke of the Pentateuch. The law, the books of Moses were summed up under the law. Do you know how long that would take? Conservatively speaking, about 900 hours. That's a half a year's work. And so he was supposed to spend the first half of his first year as king doing a Bible study about what he was and wasn't supposed to do. Now look at verse 19. And it shall be with him. He's supposed to carry this thing around, this personal Bible study, this copy of the Bible he made. And he shall read it all the days of his life. Wow. Can you imagine what a king was to be? He was supposed to be a living, personal student of the Word that was meditating on it, carrying this thing around, reading it and living it and teaching it in all that he did as king. Why is that? That he may, look at the next phrase in verse 19, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God. Because a continued exposure to this book causes us to learn about God and live a life that acknowledges Him. The next phrase, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes. Verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren. What does that mean? So he doesn't think that he can look over the rooftop of his house and look at anybody's wife he wants to and take them. And that's exactly what happened. David's heart was lifted up, and he says, wow, I'm the number one warrior. I'm the giant killer. I'm the wealthiest guy in this whole country. I'm the greatest. I'm the king of God's people, and I can have whoever and whatever I want whenever I want it. And that's what happens to David. David did not do what Deuteronomy 17:20 says. He didn't guard his heart from being lifted up above his brethren. Then the ending of this 20th verse, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So because of that little warning from God that was ignored, David's life moves on without God's protection.